Hello, my name is Andy Gilbert, and my co-authors and I work for the Illinois Natural History Survey at the Forbes Biological Station. We have monitored the vegetation community at Emiquon since the start of the restoration, and today I'm going to discuss how it has changed over time, with a special emphasis on how drawdowns over the last few years have affected the vegetation community. Historically, the IRV provided extensive and valuable habitat to migratory waterbirds and other wetland-dependent wildlife. The IRV had many backwater lakes and tributaries which were rich in aquatic vegetation. These vegetation communities often included dense patches of aquatic plants such as pondweeds, American lotus, many different species of annual and perennial grasses, and even water celery. Unfortunately, extensive leveeing and drainage has eliminated many of these natural wetlands, and it has drastically degraded hydrology of the remaining wetlands. Despite the loss and degradation of these important wetlands, the IRV remains an important resource for migratory birds in the region. Fortunately, the Upper Mississippi River and Great Lakes joint venture has made the IRV a priority in restoration, and restoration and reclamation efforts are ongoing to return structure and function to backwater lakes and wetlands in the region. One of the most substantial efforts is the Nature Conservancy's Emiquon Preserve, directly restoring, enhancing, and protecting more than 2,700 hectares of former wetlands and uplands in the central IRV. The Nature Conservancy identified key ecological attributes of specific biological characteristics or ecological processes that would guide and evaluate success of their restoration efforts at Emiquon. Because of the region's historic importance to waterfowl and other water birds, several conservation targets and associated KEAs at Emiquon were related to waterbird communities and their habitats. For our wetland monitoring, we mapped all wetland vegetation communities, mudflats, and areas containing surface water at Emiquon during the autumn. We delineated vegetation communities and other cover types using handheld field PCs, and digitized cover types in ArcGIS using field notes and GPS waypoints overlaid on high-res aerial imagery. We collect core samples in areas of non-persistent emergent vegetation to monitor moist soil seed production at Emiquon. So before I get into the vegetation communities at Emiquon, I'm going to do a quick refresher on the wet-dry cycle in wetlands. I will start with the dry marsh stage. As the name suggests, this stage is characterized by the lack of water, and this is usually caused by a drought or drawdown. During this stage, many wetland plants are able to reestablish by seed germination, and these plants can include a variety of annual grasses and sedges, cattails and bulrush, and even woody vegetation such as willow. When water is added back into the system, we enter the regenerating marsh stage. Many non-persistent vegetation species, such as those annual grasses and sedges, are drowned out, and persistent emergent vegetation, such as cattail, begin to thrive. During this stage, we also see the recolonization of many species of submerged aquatic vegetation. Over time, standing water will cause the reduction of persistent emergent vegetation, which begins the degenerating marsh stage. If prolonged periods of standing water occur, then we enter the lake marsh stage. In this stage, we observe a continuing decrease in vegetation to where emergent vegetation is confined to the edges of the marsh and submerged vegetation will disappear from deeper portions of the marsh. And the cycle starts all over when we get another drought or drawdown. We've seen aspects of the wet-dry cycle at Emiquon as the restoration has progressed. Back at the beginning of the restoration, the wetland was in the dry marsh stage, and over the first several years of the restoration, we entered the regenerating marsh stage, where there were good amounts of hemi-marsh throughout the wetland, and there were large amounts of submerged aquatic vegetation. Starting around 2012, we began to observe some signs that the wetland was entering the degenerating marsh stage. Over the next few years, we began to see a reduction in the amount of persistent emergent vegetation, and the amount of open water began to increase. In more recent years, TNC has conducted yearly drawdowns of the wetland. From year to year, the intensity of the drawdown has varied. During years of less intense drawdowns, like 2019, we still see much of the wetland covered with submerged aquatic vegetation. In years where a more intensive drawdown is conducted and a greater amount of water is removed from the wetland, like we saw in 2020 and 2021, we see much more area that is drained of water and more production of those non-persistent emergent vegetation species. Now I'm going to dig into how each of the vegetation communities has changed throughout the restoration. I will start with aquatic bed. The amount of aquatic bed has responded like we would expect during the wet-dry cycle. After the dry stage ended at the beginning of the restoration, we see a very fast increase in aquatic bed over the first few years. Then a slight decline throughout the years as we progressed towards the lake marsh stage. As expected in years where a more intensive drawdown was conducted, such as 2018, 20, and 21, we see relatively low amounts of aquatic bed habitat at Emiquon. In 2021, we observed the lowest coverage of aquatic bed at Emiquon since the first year of the restoration. The only areas where we noted aquatic bed while cover mapping was the perimeter of Flag Lake and in some of the ditches. Additionally, in past years, the aquatic bed community at Emiquon has been relatively diverse, with many species represented. In 2021, much of the aquatic bed habitat was composed of floating-leaved pondweed, with other previously abundant species such as coontail, sago pondweed, and milfoil being relatively uncommon. It appears that multiple years of conducting intense drawdowns at Emiquon and resetting the dry marsh stage has greatly reduced the amount of submerged aquatic vegetation at Emiquon. Open water habitats have also reacted as expected as the wet-dry cycle has progressed at Emiquon. During the first couple years of restoration, when the wetland was in the dry marsh stage, open water was relatively common. But when the wetland entered the regenerating marsh stage, the amount of open water dropped off sharply. Since then, the coverage of open water has gradually increased at Emiquon as the wet-dry cycle has progressed. In 2021, open water was the most common habitat type within the wetland, and it was the second highest coverage since the start of the restoration, second only to 2007, the first year of the restoration. We attribute this relatively high amount of open water in 2021 to the loss of aquatic bed, which was replaced by open water. For hemi-marsh, we observed the greatest coverage of hemi-marsh at the beginning of the regenerating marsh stage, with a decline as the wetland progressed through the wet-dry cycle. The bump you see in 2015 is a relic of the degenerating marsh stage. Large portions of the persistent emergent habitat type was dying off, and though it resembled hemi-marsh, it did not really function as hemi-marsh. During the more intense drawdown years, so 2018, 20, and 21, we see the lowest coverage of hemi-marsh to date, and that is due to the areas within the wetland where hemi-marsh typically occurred being dry. For persistent emergent habitats, we see an almost mirror opposite graph. Persistent emergent habitats were relatively uncommon at the beginning of the restoration, but increased throughout the regenerating marsh stage, until a sharp decline during the degenerating marsh stage around 2015 and 2016. During the years of the drawdown, we have observed an increase in the coverage of persistent emergent vegetation at Emiquon, which is likely due to new plants being able to sprout during the dry marsh stage. However, a large portion of the mapped persistent emergent habitat at Emiquon over the last few years has been of dead and dry cattail. These areas are primarily found on higher elevation areas and are remnant of when there were higher water levels at Emiquon, and these areas were dense stands of flooded cattail. In 2021, since these areas have been dry for a few years, the dead cattail had degraded enough to be mostly flat to the ground. And due to the lack of other vegetation in these areas, it appears that the dead cattail is inhibiting the growth of other vegetation. In the spring of 2021, a burn was conducted in one of these areas in the northeast corner of Emiquon, and that fire removed much of the dead cattail. After the burn, we observed a great response from the vegetation community in that area, and a dense stand of cattail shoots emerged. However, since this area was of higher elevation, the soil moisture quickly dried throughout the summer. This stunted the growth of the cattail, but the non-persistent vegetation flourished and quickly outcompeted the cattail. When we cover mapped this area in the autumn, this area was a very tall and dense stand of annual grasses and smartweed. Moving on to the scrub-shrub communities at Emiquon. For the most part, woody vegetation has been a very low component of the vegetation community at Emiquon. In most years, it makes up less than 1% of the area of Emiquon. However, in recent years, since the drawdown has put much of the wetland back into the dry marsh stage, the amount of woody vegetation has increased at Emiquon, especially in 2021. After having two relatively dry years in a row, the coverage of woody vegetation, which is mostly composed of willow, increased its coverage by nearly 5 times. If drawdowns are continued at Emiquon in 2022 and beyond, we will need to keep an eye on the coverage of woody vegetation at Emiquon and see if this sharp increase continues. And finally, the non-persistent emergent vegetation community. For much of the restoration of Emiquon, non-persistent vegetation has been a relatively low component of the overall vegetation community, especially in years of high water when the non-persistent vegetation was primarily limited to the very perimeter of the wetland. However, since the more intense drawdowns have started in 2018, we have observed a great response in non-persistent vegetation. In 2018 and 2020, non-persistent vegetation was the most common vegetation community at Emiquon, and in 2021 it was the second most common vegetation community at Emiquon. This non-persistent vegetation, also known as moist soil vegetation, is an important producer of seeds which make up a large portion of the diets of waterfowl and other wetland bird species. The moist soil seed density at Emiquon has hovered around the average of other IDNR and federal wetlands in the area. But since the start of the drawdowns, the moist soil seed density has increased drastically at Emiquon. Another measure of moist soil seed production is duck energy days, or DEDs. DEDs are a measure of how many ducks can be supported by the moist soil seeds produced at a wetland. Prior to the drawdowns, the DED goal for Emiquon was only met once, but the increased moist soil seed density paired with the increased coverage of non-persistent vegetation during drawdown years has increased DEDs above the goal at Emiquon since 2018, with a high of approximately 13 million DEDs in 2018. However, we wanted to dig deeper into this DED calculation at Emiquon. So we took the cover map layer of our non-persistent emergent habitat and overlaid it with the 6-inch elevation contours at Emiquon. This allowed us to calculate how many hectares of non-persistent emergent vegetation was flooded at a corresponding water level at Emiquon. And we did this for both drawdown years of 2020 and 2021. By incorporating water elevation gauge data, we could then determine how many DEDs were available to waterfowl each month. In 2020, we see that much less moist soil habitat was available compared to 2021. This was due to TNC not being able to bring in water during the autumn. However, in 2021, a year where the wetland was reflooded in autumn, we only see approximately 13% of the moist soil vegetation flooded and available. This corresponds to approximately 860,000 DEDs, which is lower than the KEA goal of 1 million DEDs at Emiquon. In each of these years, DEDs did not rise above the 1 million DED goal until that following spring, which is good because that means that there is newly flooded habitat for spring migrating birds. But even at the highest water levels over the last couple of years, there are still large portions of the total DEDs that were not available to waterfowl. Another noticeable change over the last couple of years has been the reduction in water clarity. The water is much muddier than compared to previous years of the restoration. This decreased water clarity may also be a contributing factor to the decrease in aquatic bed habitat over the last couple of years. So, over the last few years, we've seen that drawdowns have reset the dry marsh stage over large portions of Emiquon, which has affected the vegetation composition of Emiquon greatly. Some habitat types, such as non-persistent emergent and open water, have expanded greatly, and others, such as aquatic bed and hemi-marsh, have decreased. However, in 2019, when water levels were higher and more stable, we did see a bump in aquatic bed and cattail throughout the wetland, so a return to that water regime would likely cause a similar result in the future. Additionally, the drawdowns have increased the coverage of non-persistent emergent vegetation, which is a good source of food for many species of waterfowl. However, if drawdowns are continued over the next several years, habitat types such as shrub-scrub will need to be monitored to see if its expansion continues. With that, I would like to thank all of our partners who have helped with this research, and thank TNC for allowing us to conduct this research on their property. If there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them.